This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 323 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Just as a reminder, this is the last Late Round Podcast episode of the week, so there won't be a mailbag show this week. But be sure to tune into my weekly Facebook Live on the FanDuel Facebook page at noon Eastern on Sunday. I'll be answering any last-minute start-sit questions. Now on to this show. Last week was a good one with this matchups episode. I was right to devalue Dak Prescott and Aaron Rodgers, and Baker Mayfield outproduced both players. I got off of Carson Wentz with all the news about his wide receivers. I talked about that on my Facebook Live, so that ended up being good. Bo Scarborough had a pretty good game, all things considered. Latavius Murray was a nice deep option. Brian Hill and Royce Freeman sucked, and Allen Robinson bounced back. Wide receiver was easily the worst position, though. I didn't expect the Colts to be as run-heavy as they were against Houston, and Zach Pascal ended up as a bad deeper play. And Golden Tate ended up finding the end zone late, which saved his day. But I do actually think that the process was okay with Golden Tate last week because he only had 33 yards. And then DK Metcalf underperformed in just an ugly, ugly game for fantasy purposes. But overall, given I'm talking about iffy players on this show, it was a pretty strong week. On to week 13. Before looking at players that I'm higher and lower on versus consensus this week, though, there's another weekly free roll for all of you loyal FanDuel Podcast Network listeners. Head to fanduel.com/league/numberfire, enter a lineup, and have a shot to win free Numberfire Premium to go along with a little bit of cash. That's fanduel.com/league/numberfire. Quarterback is pretty fun this week. You can make the case for a lot of guys who are ranked as mid-range QB2s to be QB1s and then vice versa. One of those mid to lower end QB2s this week who I think should be ranked higher is Jared Goff. Yes, that Jared Goff. The one who hasn't thrown a touchdown pass since October. He's in play. Like I talked about on the 10 Trends show, Goff has faced a pretty tough schedule over his last 3 games. He's faced Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Baltimore. Each of those teams not only have been good against fantasy quarterbacks, but Chicago and Pittsburgh rank really high in pressure rate. And Baltimore's just playing lights out defensively since they got Marcus Peters. Realistically, Goff hasn't been all that bad in plus matchups this year. In fact, he's been pretty good in them. He's played 6 games against defenses that rank in the bottom half of the league in fantasy points allowed when adjusted for strength of opponent. So bad teams against fantasy quarterbacks. In those games, he's averaged 20 fantasy points per game. In his 5 games against good defenses or top half defenses, that number falls to 4.8. That's obviously a very massive difference. And he gets one of the best matchups on paper this week against the Cardinals, who are one of those bottom half teams. They've allowed fewer than 14 fantasy points just once this season. So Jared Goff is most definitely in play this week after a really rough month of football. Carson Wentz is too. He's been pretty bad of late, averaging just 11.5 fantasy points per game over his last 5 contests. Now, to be fair, he faced Dallas, Buffalo, Chicago, New England, and then this past week, he didn't have his weapons, and that was a game against Seattle. So there's at least some reason for him not performing all that well, but when you watch Wentz, he has looked pretty bad. Now, with that being said, a matchup against Miami should be able to fix things. The Dolphins are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this year, and they've given up at least 12.5 fantasy points in every single game. So Carson Wentz has a good floor for the first time in weeks. If you want a deeper play, I think Daniel Jones is really undervalued this week at QB 28. It's true that Green Bay has allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this year, but they've also given up the 9th most passing yards. They've actually allowed 306 passing yards per game over their last 7 games. They've been pretty fortunate to have only allowed 14 passing touchdowns. Teams are giving up a passing touchdown on every 164 passing yards this year. Green Bay's allowed one for every 215 yards. That's the 6th best rate in football. So maybe we're looking at some regression for that Packers defense. That would help Danny Dimes. I am less bullish on this game if Golden Tate does miss the contest. Now at quarterback this week, it's hard to really be a hater with a lot of plays, but I do think that we've got another situation where you don't absolutely have to play the stud who's facing New England. In this case, it's Deshaun Watson. Only Lamar Jackson has been able to rank higher than QB 20 in weekly scoring against the Patriots this year. And when adjusted for strength of opponent, they're giving up 8.3 fewer points than their opponent's season-long averages. If you want to just use that number and associate it with Deshaun Watson, that would give you an expected fantasy total this week of 13.3 points. Now, I'm not saying that that's where he'll finish this week. But what I am saying is that locking him up as a for sure QB1 this week isn't all that wise given what the Patriots have done this year. It's a tough matchup for Deshaun Watson. Jordan Howard has still been limited to non-contact work in practice. That means Miles Sanders could be the lead back for Philly once again. Like I talked about on the 10 Trends show, Sanders hasn't produced in fantasy without Howard, but the peripheral numbers are absolutely there. He's been playing about 85% of the team's snaps without Howard, and he's seen his running back rush share rise by about 30%. Against a Miami team that's well below average against opposing running backs, Sanders is a very solid start this week if Jordan Howard doesn't play. Ronald Jones is another guy who's kind of been a fringe starter, but I like him this week as well. Jacksonville's defense has been pathetic against running backs over their last 3 games. They gave up an RB11 and an RB21 performance to Duke Johnson and Carlos Hyde, an RB12, 14, and 23 performance to the trio of Colts running backs, and then a big game last week to Derrick Henry. They've been a well below average team against opposing running backs this season. And Ronald Jones has had pretty good ground game usage basically since week 2. But over his last 5 games, he's also averaging a 10.5% target share. He's being used more as a receiver. In a game that could be fairly high scoring, he makes for a good RB2. Now digging a little bit deeper is Jamal Williams. Aaron Jones is the superior play to Jamal Williams, don't take this the wrong way, but the gap between Jones to Williams is really big. Jones is the RB5 in consensus rankings on Fantasy Pros, whereas Williams is RB34. Williams has kind of been ridiculous since coming back from his concussion too. He's averaging 15.6 PPR points per game over this time, and he's finished worse than RB13 in weekly scoring just once. During this time, he's seen roughly 37% of the team's running back rushes and 13.8% of Green Bay's targets. Across the same time period, Aaron Jones has a 60% running back rush share, so 23 percentage points higher, and a 12% target share, which is lower than Williams. Again, Aaron Jones is the superior play, and Jones actually should be ranked as high as he is this week. The thing I don't understand is the lack of love for Williams, who's seeing the work, who should be in a positive game script, and who's facing a very average defense. Now, even deeper than Jamal Williams is Darrell Williams. He should take on a bigger role if Damian Williams does indeed miss time. As of Wednesday, Damian Williams hasn't practiced this week. And that's a pretty big deal because, like I said on the 15 Transaction show, Damian was seeing over 70% of Kansas City snaps pretty consistently over the last few weeks. Darrell Williams has been relevant this year, and he'll likely play behind LaShawn McCoy if Damian can't go. But it's a plus matchup, and the Chiefs are 9.5-point favorites, which means they might not overwork their veteran running back. So this is really less of a super quantitative recommendation and more of a Darrell Williams will be the RB2 in a good offense that should score a lot of points. That's the type of play that he is. Kenyon Drake is listed at RB25 this week, and while that could easily hit, I do worry with both David Johnson and Chase Edmonds being back from injury. Cliff Kingsbury said on Wednesday that there is definitely a way to integrate 3 running backs into the game plan and that, quote, it's on us as an offensive staff to find different ways to get them involved. The ball can only go to so many players. There are only so many plays in a game. So even though the matchup is fine, I do think that we should temper expectations a little bit when it comes to Kenyon Drake. And then workload issues could be there for Chris Carson this week too. Rashad Penny stole a 64% running back rush share in that backfield last week because Chris Carson couldn't hold on to the football. But Carson's still ranked as the RB18 this week. I'd bump him lower and into the tier with someone like Miles Sanders or Ronald Jones only because we don't really know. This is how the running back position often works in fantasy. You've got to try and read a coaching staff before a game starts, and the read right now is that Chris Carson might not be as involved this week as he was earlier in the season. We saw them change things up last week. And it's not like they've got this amazing matchup either. Minnesota's been a top 10 team against opposing running backs this year when adjusted for strength of schedule. Robert Woods is undervalued this week. I really like Cooper Kupp to smash in this spot because the Cardinals have been awful against slot receivers, but Bobby Woods shouldn't be ranked at wide receiver 32. He's been a wide receiver 2 or better in 3 of his last 4 games, and he's dipped below a 17% target share just once since week 2. It's a plus matchup against Arizona like I talked about with Jared Goff, and also like I talked about with Goff, the Rams offense is clearly better in these good matchups. So Woods is a good play this week, and he also has some positive touchdown regression coming. I talked about Anthony Miller on the 10 Trends show, and I also teased that I'd bring him up on this matchup show, and here we are. We're talking about Anthony Miller. There's nothing more powerful than an Anthony Miller tease. But Miller's seen a 24% and 22% target share over his last 2 games, and Taylor Gabriel's out. He has a concussion. On top of that, Miller's got a really good matchup in the slot against Detroit. He's played 79% of his snaps from that area of the field this year, and Detroit's allowed almost 35% of the targets that they've faced to go to the slot. That's a top 5 rate in football. So I like Miller this week. Chris Conley is also someone who I think is being undervalued this week. Over his last 5 games, he's averaged almost a 21% target share. And since Nick Foles returned, he's out-targeted D.D. Westbrook 17-15. And the difference between Westbrook and Conley is that Conley's average at the target is a lot better. On the year, Conley's seen a 14.9 ADOT. Westbrook's is at 6.6. To me, all of this evidence points to Chris Conley being a better play than D.D. Westbrook, but Westbrook is ranked ahead of him. They both should be fine this week, though, because they get Tampa Bay. The Bucs are allowing 12 more points per game to opposing team wide receivers than those same wide receivers have scored per game across the entire season. That's by far the highest mark in the league, and it's not close. So all Jags wideouts are in play, but I wanted to give a special shout out to Chris Conley. Russell Gage is an even deeper play that you could look to this week. He's more of a floor play rather than a ceiling one, but he's continued to see work since Mohamed Sanu left for New England. He's averaged a 16.5 target share per game without Sanu. He's played 60% of his snaps this year from the slot, and New Orleans leads the league in percentage of targets that have gone to that area of the field this year. That makes Gage, in a negative game script, kind of an intriguing deeper option. Sammy Watkins is the wide receiver 30 this week on Fantasy Pros. Now, everything points to that being a logical take, except for the fact that Sammy Watkins has been in this spot before. It's a plus matchup, and I don't actually mind Watkins all that much this week, but it's hard to ignore his past performances. He's ranked higher than wide receiver 38 just once since week 1. And it's hard for me to put him ahead of someone like Robert Woods, who's actually ranked below him this week. So sure, Watkins is fine, but I don't have the most confidence in the world in him. Lastly, there's DeAndre Hopkins. You're not benching DeAndre Hopkins, but I need to show some love for that New England secondary and how good they've been this year. The Patriots have allowed just 3 wide receiver 2 or better performances on the entire season. One was to Golden Tate, who needed a 64-yard touchdown to get there. One was to Steven Sims, who needed a 65-yard rush. And then Cole Beasley was the wide receiver 20 back in week 4, and he needed 13 targets. This is all while facing Juju Smith-Schuster with Ben Roethlisberger, Odell Beckham, John Brown, Jarvis Landry, Amari Cooper, who had a goose egg last week, and the list goes on and on. It's a horrific matchup for Hopkins. I think Hopkins should be started, and it's really hard to rank him a lot lower than where he's being ranked, but I wanted to at least set expectations for him this week because it could be rough. Mike Gesicki has now seen a 16.8% target share over his last 3 games, which have come without Preston Williams in that lineup. Last week, he ran more routes, according to Pro Football Focus, than any other tight end. And there's likely to be another negative game script for the Dolphins this week. Even though the matchup against Philadelphia is a little bit below average, I think that he's a pretty good tight end streamer. My deep tight end streamer this week, though, is Jaden Graham. He hasn't been very impactful for fantasy purposes with Austin Hooper sidelined. He has only 3 catches over those 2 games, but he actually ran the second most routes at the tight end position last week. He obviously has a floor of 0, but if you're really desperate, he could be your tight end streamer this week. The Panthers defense is still out there in 45% of Yahoo leagues when you could easily argue that they're the best defense this week. Washington's allowed the 4th highest sack rate this year, and Dwayne Haskins has been sacked over 4 times per game since becoming starter. Carolina, a big home favorite, is 2nd in the NFL in sack rate. The matchup is perfect. Now, there aren't a ton of defenses that are rostered at a really low rate that you could use this week, so I'll just rattle off some that may be on your waiver wire. Philadelphia against Miami, that's an obvious play. Green Bay against New York, that's another strong play. And even the Chargers against Denver are also in play. So hopefully one of those defenses are available for you. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving.